So, welcome to this fourth and final part of Lecture 2 on normative ethical theories. I hope you're still with me. If you are, that's applaudable to you. I'm happy that you're still listening. So, let's discuss this last theory that was scheduled for today's lecture, and that is the ethics of duty. So, Immanuel Kant, was the founder of this theory. He's also a much renowned, a well-known philosopher, at least in the Western European continent. And this theory is also called the deontology of Kant, or the ethics of duty. It's not just a very important ethical theory. It was highly influential, but it's also a theory that's very much used in business ethics. And I hope that it will become clear today why this theory is still very influential, and also how you can actually use this theory in your own practice in your own lives. I have to say that it's quite a challenging theory. One of the main reasons for this is that Kant, he was a German philosopher, and he was really well known for his not very, how do you say that? He wasn't really easy to grasp. So his writing is in long sentences, sometimes sentences that are longer than a page. It was in difficult German that he wrote, right? So it can be challenging also to grasp the concepts, to understand what they are about. But I hopefully can explain it a bit to you today. But also feel free to read the book, to practice with it, to come to the tutorials and to ask questions, because I think that will be the way to sort of understand what this theory is really about. But let us start off today with an introduction. So if you remember this distinction that I introduced in part 3 of today's lecture between consequentialist theories and non-consequentialist theories, then the deontology of Kant can be positioned under the non-consequentialist theories. So in contrast to utilitarianism, which was a consequentialist theory, ethics of duty is qualified as a non-consequentialist theory. So rather than looking at the outcomes, the consequences of an act, ethics of duty feels that the motivation or the principles that lead to a certain action are most important. So if you want to determine the moral rightness of an action, you should not look at the consequences of an act, but you should look at the motivation for this act, right? So in other words, we look at the internal factors, so the factors that are going on inside of you, your motivations, your rationale, that lead you to execute a certain action, rather than the external consequences. So if we were to say that the motivation is the most important aspect to decide upon the morality of an action, then of course we need some kind of principle to which the motivation should adhere to. So how can we decide whether a motive is actually the right motive? So that's something that we're going to find out. So the book defines ethics of duty in the following way. And it's also posted on the slide so you can read with me. So ethical theories that consist of abstract, unchangeable obligations defined by a set of rationally deduced a priori moral rules which should be applied to all relevant ethical problems. I think this is a whole mouthful, and I can very much imagine that if you read this that you don't really understand what Crane and Matten are actually trying to tell here. So let us have a look at some parts of this definition and discuss what they mean. So it's an ethical theory that consists of abstract, unchangeable obligations. And this refers to this absolute nature of ethics of duty, right? It's an absolutist theory. So the obligations are rules. They are things that we need to abide to, right? So I might tell you that you need to work on a certain assignment. Well, that is a sort of obligation that you have to work on an assignment because there is a deadline. And also here in this theory, we're talking about obligations that apply to all situations and problems, right? So to every human being, these rules actually apply. And this is exactly what absolute means, right? It will apply always, anywhere, without exceptions, regardless of the context, who we are, etc. Then if we continue, Crane and Metten write that these obligations are defined by a set of rationally deduced a priori moral rules. And what they are actually writing here is that these obligations, that's something that you can actually come up with in your head. So if you're going to think about them rationally, use your mind without knowing the consequences, you can come up with these moral rules by just thinking. We're all rational human beings, right? We can think for ourselves, we have a free mind, we can make up or we can decide what we want to do. And also these moral rules, these are rules that we can actually come up with by thinking clearly. And if we were to do so, we would find these rules that Kant has actually outlined. The moral rules, and maybe this helps a bit to sort of understand what this is about, is like a mathematical object. So if you think about a very simple sum, 1 plus 1 is equal to 2, then I'm sure that this is something that you all know and that you can come up with just thinking clearly and rationally. There's no way around this, right? If you know sort of the mathematical laws and the mathematical logic, then there is no exception to the rule that 1 plus 1 is equal to 2. So there is something that if you, right, you know the mathematical steps, then we should all agree that this holds. And this is very similar to this moral rule of Kant, right? So if we can think clearly enough about morality, then we should find that there is a set of rules that apply to everybody. The last part is indeed this sort of universality principle, right? So these moral rules should be applied to all relevant ethical problems. And that's also the absolute nature of the theory again, right? So they are unchangeable and they apply to all problems, irrespective of the consequences. So that's a brief introduction of ethics of duty. Bear with me. And I want to introduce the founder of this theory to you, and this is Immanuel Kant, and he lived in the 18th and 19th century. He was a German Enlightenment philosopher, and he was, I think, well, still up to date, he's one of the most influential Western philosophers. Not just known for his ethical theory, but he wrote a lot of other books on how the world works. And he's still very important in how we think about ethics and morality, not just in ethics and philosophy, but also business ethicists adopt his thinking and how they think about ethics in business. So interestingly, he was very much against utilitarianism. So Kant actually believed that we can never ever calculate what the value of a human life. If you remember this example of Philip Morris that I ended part 3 of today's lecture with, then also there, right, we discussed that measuring human life is something that is very difficult and probably also one of the main problems with utilitarianism. And Kant was also, well, he also thought that we cannot weigh the life of a human life against that of someone else. So according to Kant, and that's sort of the enlightenment in his thinking, or I think the context, right? So if you remember what enlightenment was about, this was the time that people started to think for themselves. They realized that human beings had a very unique characteristic, and that was actually their mind, right? The ability to think freely for yourself. And this is essential to Kant, his theory. So to him, all of us human beings have a fundamental human dignity that should be respected in all. And this human dignity, has to do with the fact that we can think for ourselves. So we're all rational human beings, and that also means that if we put some effort in it, we can think about our own moral worth. How much dignity, how dignified are we? Because we can also think about this and recognize it in ourselves, we can also recognize it in others, right? And this is something that should be respected. All the human beings should be respected for the fact that they can actually think in their own right, regardless of the consequences. I know this, well, might still seem a bit vague, but if you remember and take away this idea of humans can think for themselves, and that this also gives some kind of human dignity to all human beings, and that this is something that was valued by Kant, then you can take that with you and remember it for the rest of the theory, because it will be an important ingredient in understanding Kant. So let's continue to the next slide. So if you remember that this is a non-consequentialist theory, then motivation is of critical importance, right? So the motivation for a certain act, why you are doing something, that is actually critical if we want to determine whether an act is right or wrong. So it's not the consequences. We're going to disregard consequences altogether, but we're just going to focus on the motivation. And for Kant, it's not just any motivation, right? So only the motivation that is done out of a sense of duty, because it's the right thing to do, is the motivation that would lead to a right action. So we need to look critically at our motives and check whether they are seeking goodness for goodness sake. Because, and that's also written on the slide, right, it is our moral duty irrespective of the consequences. So if we are seeking goodness for goodness sake, then the act that follows is morally right. I can imagine that this still sounds a bit vague, so I have an example as an illustration. Suppose you are an executive of a pharmaceutical company. You can make, maybe you're producing drugs that cure certain diseases. Well, you can come up with an example, I guess. So at some point you find out that somewhere in your production chain something has gone wrong, terribly wrong. This error is actually so big and so detrimental that it can harm your customers once they consume your product. It could be some kind of toxin. Well, at least you know immediately that your consumers are at risk and they might even die. Now the question is, what are you going to do, right? There is an ethical dilemma that arises from this. Are you going to retract your products, not sell them, or are you not going to do anything? So you might decide to recall the product to safeguard your customers. I think many of us would agree that that is the good decision in this situation. Well, to Kant, this is actually only a good action if you do this because it is the right thing to do. If you seek goodness for goodness sake. So if you would have another motivation, for example, because you would get sued or lose profits after it has, well, if people were to find out, etc. This would not be a motive that seeks goodness for goodness sake, but has some kind of other interest at heart, right? And the consequence, remember, does not matter. So even though if you were to recall the product and people would not die, it does not matter. Only the motive matters for Kant. So if you do this because you seek goodness for goodness sake, you want to do the right thing just because it's the right thing, then it would be a good act according to Kant. One other important aspect of or for ethics of duty and to decide whether an act is actually morally right or wrong is the fact that these moral prescriptions, so these moral rules that you need to seek goodness for goodness sake, is actually universal, right? So it's for everybody. And again, that links back to this enlightenment principle of knowing that everybody is rational and thus has some sense of human autonomy and human dignity, also means that this moral duty is the same for everybody. So everybody has to oblige to these moral rules. Well, we now know that motivation is important. We know that the right motive seeks goodness for goodness sake. And we also know that moral prescriptions are universal. But there's one key thing that we don't really know yet, and that is, how do we know what we need to do? How do we know which motive seeks goodness for goodness sake? So for Kant, the right motive is that motive that follows a certain rational moral principle. And that is something that we're going to look into in a bit. So the fundamental principle of morality is the categorical imperative. So in order to find out whether your motive is the correct motive, the motive that seeks goodness for goodness sake, you can use the categorical imperative to find out whether the motive is indeed a good motive. So this principle, the categorical imperative, is like a tool that we can use to decide whether a motive is a good motive. And it's called like this because it's categorical, so it applies to everybody in the category human, right? So it's unconditionally, and it's an imperative because it's imposed on us with the force of law. It cannot be escaped. It's like a duty, and it tells us to do certain things in a certain way. So an imperative is like, I would tell you now to, well, or a police officer tells you to walk on the pavement or to whatever. You are bound to have to do that as a force, right? So also here, a categorical imperative is like a force that you cannot escape. And it's categorical because it applies to everybody unconditionally. So everybody who is a human being has to oblige to this categorical imperative. Now, the main question is, of course, well, what is this categorical imperative? So let me tell you a bit about this. So the categorical imperative is a tool, as I already told you, to derive moral laws, to find out whether a motive is actually a good motive. So it's a way to establish whether an action, and thus a motive, is the right action. So there are different formulations of this principle, this categorical imperative, 3 of them, and we're going to discuss 2 in the remainder of this lecture today. So these 2 are called, and let me also just write or read out loud what's written on the slide. So we have the universal acceptability principle, which tells us that we should act only according to that maxim, rule, whereby you can at the same time will that it should become a universal law without contradiction. The other version is also called respect for persons or autonomy, and that tells us to act in such a way that you treat humanity, whether in your own person or in the person of any other, never merely as a means to an end, but always at the same time as an end. So I can imagine that you are wondering, well, what did I just hear? What does this mean? So let us dig a bit deeper into these 2 versions and discuss what they indeed imply for us, because I think that you will agree in 10 minutes or so that it's all not too complicated. The writing is, but understanding what it's about is much more understandable. At least I hope so. So the universal acceptability version of the categorical imperative, let's call it version 1, tells you that you should only act according to that rule of which we can think and want it as a universal principle without contradiction. Right? So the question here is, well, imagine that you're going to do something. The question then will be, well, what is the general rule behind your action? Why are you doing something like this? And then the second step would be, well, what would happen if everybody acted according to this rule? So you can only act according to those principles of which you think that they can become a universal principle. And you can check this in two ways. So you can imagine a world in which all people would act according to that principle or rule without contradiction. And then the second question could be, well, would I want to live in a world that then arises? Let me give you an example. So imagine that I have a rule that littering, if I'm outside, I can litter. So I can just throw my trash away when I'm walking outside. If I'm drinking something, a bottle of Coke or so, there's no trash bin, I can throw it on the pavement. Right? That would be the rule. So littering is okay. What would Kant say of this? So if we're going to apply this first version of the categorical imperative, we should ask ourselves, well, what would happen if everybody would act according to this rule? So what would happen if everybody would start to litter? Walking outside, they'd just throw all their trash on the floor. Well, it would mean that we would get a world that won't be clean. There will be trash everywhere outside. It would be a complete chaos, maybe. It would be a world full of trash, environmental problems. Well, and then the second question is, well, do we want something like that, right? Would this be a good world to live in? Well, I hope that we all agree, or I guess I'm almost sure that we will all agree that this is not a good world to live in, right? And if that's the conclusion, then that would mean that littering is not an ethically good act according to ethics of duty. If you have a look at the slide, it also writes that we should imagine a world in which all people act according to a principle without contradiction. Right? So what does this actually mean? That these actions or these rules cannot contradict itself. So let me give you another example. So if we have a look at the second rule, stealing is wrong except if I do it. Well, if we were to apply the principle we just discussed, then first we have to imagine a world in which all people are acting according to this principle. So that means that everybody would steal, but at the same time also say that this is wrong. Well, that's a contradiction, right? You cannot at the same time steal, but also determine or have the opinion that this is something that actually is ethically wrong. Cannot be universally wanted or applied without contradiction in this sense. Same for promise keeping. First example, I'll make promises that I'll break whenever keeping them no longer suits my purposes. Well, imagine that this would be done by everybody. Well, we could never trust someone because everybody will just break their promise whenever they feel like it. Right? So if you think about the example of imagine a world, well, probably this would be a world where promise keeping would no longer have any value. And such a world would also not be a world that we want, right? Contracts will become meaningless, doing business would become difficult to have trustful relationships with others, etc. It would be a world where nobody would like to live in. So if you apply these two versions, or let's say these two questions, right? Can we imagine a world without contradiction? And then do we want a world without contradiction? For these examples, and try it maybe also at home to see if you can write those examples out and apply the universality principle to this, then you will eventually reach the conclusion that indeed stealing, littering, or breaking promises whenever you feel like it cannot be ethically correct according to ethics of duty. Let's go to the second version of the categorical imperative, and that's the respect for persons version. And this second version is also called the autonomy principle, and that tells us that we should not treat humanity as an end, or we should treat humanity as an end and never only as a means. Well, what does this mean? So remember that we have this view, or Kant has this view of humans being able to think for themselves, being rational, and that this also gives humans the autonomy to think for themselves. It also gives them human dignity, since we're all rational human beings. And this fundamental human dignity gives us, but also installs in others, that we can never only use people to gain something for ourselves. Human dignity should be respected in others, and respect as a human, as a rational human being that is free to think, act, and want things, gives us sort of gives us the strength or the value that we can never be exploited for someone else's gain. So what this also means is, because it says never as a means only, that we can sometimes, it's okay to use someone as long as you also recognize the freedom and the autonomy of the other person. So they should be still free to set their own goals, for example. And it should be not just merely treating them as a means. There must be some room for interest of others, or to come up with your own decisions, etc. Right? So there might also be implications for business. Imagine or think of ads, and there's also an example here on the slide. Many advertising businesses, they try to persuade us to buy something, right? Or to maybe even not think that we can actually make a choice for ourselves, but they address us as if we were an object. So also on the example here on the slide, it reads, the thing you want when you order salad. It almost tells us that we are mistaken about our own goals. We chose a salad because probably you choose it because you like it. And McDonald's tells us, well, actually, I know what you want, and this is not a salad. So it tries in a way to set goals for us. And Kant, if he would still live in today's world, he would not agree with this, right? We should be able to make our own decisions. We should be treated as an autonomous person that can reach goals for themselves, that can set goals for themselves. So rather than sort of telling us what we should do, a good ad should convince us about something rather than sort of persuading us into it. So two versions. One, the universal applicability principle. Can we want something like this without contradiction? And does that result in a world that we would like to live in? And then the second version of the categorical imperative tells us that we should respect ourselves and others as an end and never only as a means. Let's have a look at two more examples in the business context, and that's also the point where we will end today's lecture. So let me quickly discuss these two final examples. So ethics of duty can also be very interesting to use in an organizational context. It's also something that is much often, it's often done. There are various books about Kantian business ethics, for example, as this categorical imperative, so this rule that we have been discussing today, it provides a very solid standard for the formulation of rules, and they are applicable to any business circumstance, right? So if you are going to decide something within an organization, then you can of course use the categorical imperative to check whether the decision is in line with the imperative. And that would, for example, yield that you need to pay a fair wage to your employees, that you should treat them as an end in themselves, right? If you think of advertisement practices, then also there, with the example of McDonald's, Kantian ethics can have an interesting perspective, etc. Of course, there are also some objections to ethics of duty. So some might claim that ethics of duty is too extreme. Remember, that's an absolute theory that is very demanding, right? We always need to do the right thing. I don't know whether you know someone that always does the right thing, but of course humans also make mistakes, right? An implication and an example that people often think of, if you think about the categorical imperative being too extreme, is the fact that lying, according to Kant, is always wrong, right? Imagine a world where everybody would tell lies, then promise keeping, having trustful relationships would no longer exist. That's not a world that we would like to live in, right? So lying is never right. But you can, of course, imagine that there are also situations where lying could, for example, save someone's life. Or you might tell a a lie to spare someone's feelings. Are these lies also so wrong? I would be doubtful there, right? So I could very much imagine that in some circumstances, lying is actually the right thing to do. Some other critiques, they claim or they focus on the motives of duty, and they say, well, Kant is very, well, let's say, restricting in that sense by only focusing on motives of duty. What about empathy or other reasons that are very valid to base a choice on? So the picture here shows you a turtle with plastic around his neck. And just imagine that you come across this picture and you're so moved and you feel so bad for the turtle that you decide to donate 100 euros to Greenpeace. Well, that's a decision that is made out of empathy with the turtle. Would this, because it's motivated not by a sense of duty but by a sense of empathy, would this then be an incorrect or an unjust act? Well, according to Kant, it would not be correct, right? It would not be an act out of duty. But I guess that most of us would, of course, agree with the idea that donating money because you, well, are emphasizing with a person or with an animal is actually a very valid reason to do something. Well, just to give you some homework, a little test. If you think back to the trolley problem that we discussed in the first part of this lecture, then I would be very interested to know how you would apply the categorical imperative and the theory of utilitarianism to these two scenarios. I would say try to do this at home, maybe discuss it with other students to see sort of how this reasoning can be applied and which different conclusions you reach if you think about ethics of duty versus a utilitarian perspective. Well, we're at the end of today's lecture. We have been discussing a lot, so if you're still listening, that's, well, I think you did a good job. So we've been discussing various normative ethical theories. We distinguish between ethical relativism and ethical absolutism. And then within the category of ethical absolutism, we discussed on the one hand utilitarianism and on the other hand ethics of duty. I guess this is just a nice summary overview that you can maybe use when you're going to study all these different theories and apply them in an assignment. Well, that's all for today. I hope you enjoyed it, and then we'll see each other next week. Bye.